family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. You know, a lot of black folks in New York were celebrating when the corrupt former DA of Manhattan, Cy Vance, announced that he was stepping down from the criminal organization called the DA's Office of Manhattan. Cy Vance, who refused to prosecute Harvey Weinstein until the scandal of Me Too broke. Cy Vance, who also refused to prosecute the hate criminal Amy Cooper, who made a false report to the police. Oh, a lot of black folks were hoping that things were going to be different. There would be a new sheriff in town. Hell, it's hard to imagine anyone worse than Cy Vance, but of course, there's always someone worse. So, when Alvin Bragg announced that he was going to be running for DA of Manhattan, there were no doubt a lot of black folks who got their hopes up, but you gotta do people's paperwork. Alvin Bragg worked in both the New York State Attorney General's office and the U.S. Attorney's office. So it's pretty obvious this guy has been a known quantity to white supremacy for a long time now. You see, the fix was in from the very beginning. New York is the media and the finance capital of the world. You don't get the kind of financing that Alvin Bragg was able to get without white power already signing off on you. He wasn't savaged by the white media in New York, and that's because the fix was in. All these white media outlets, they didn't make it a point to attack him as soft on crime or to besmirch his education or to imply that this guy just doesn't have what it takes, because they knew that they wanted someone who would be soft on crime so long as the crimes being committed came from the dominant society. Now, a big part of the smokescreen that Alvin Bragg was able to throw up was that he had been involved in representing the family of Eric Garner, who had been murdered by Daniel Pontalio, formerly of the NYPD. And that was Alvin Bragg's little calling card. Anytime that somebody was questioning whether or not this career prosecutor, who put God knows how many black people in prison and refused to put God knows how many cops away, when people were questioning him, he would point and say, "Why, I've been hoping to represent the family of Eric Garner. What have you been doing for the Garner family?" That's what he would be saying. So there were people who allowed themselves to hope and believe that maybe, just maybe, this man who really hadn't done anything to prove that he was on Team Black Empowerment, that maybe, just maybe, he was going to go against type. Well, they wouldn't have long to wait to find out whether or not they were right or wrong. Enter the case of Miya Ponsetto. You recall her. She's the white Latina who called herself attacking a 14-year-old black child. Her pretense for this racist, violent attack was that this kid stole her cell phone when she had actually left it in an Uber that she had been in. And this was just one of a string of crimes that this woman's been committing nationwide, which the white media conveniently leaves out. They talk about her as if the only crime she committed was the hate crime against that 14-year-old child. This is part of protecting her, pretending as if this is just a one-off for her. Instead of listing all the stuff that she's done, pointing out this is a career criminal, instead they try to make it seem like, oh, this is just one incident. Well, obviously this was a clear-cut hate crime, and even Alvin Bragg had to charge her with that, though obviously he didn't want to, because while Alvin Bragg made an enormous deal out of his charging her with a hate crime, unlawful imprisonment in the second degree in this case, he made a big deal out of that. But once the cameras were gone, then he did what he really was aiming to do, which was to go ahead and quietly bury this. He allowed her to plead guilty to unlawful imprisonment in the second degree as a hate crime, but he also said she gets to have probation, no jail time. Now, some of you may say, well, that is a felony though that she had to plead to. Yeah, but not for very long, because part of the plea deal that Alvin Bragg has offered to Ponsetto is that after 2 years, I'm sure he's hoping that everybody will have forgotten about this by then, but 2 years from now, he's going to allow her to re-plea. This time to a reduced charge of aggravated harassment in the second degree, which is a misdemeanor. So Alvin Bragg has set up this little mechanism for this hate criminal. While she's in front of the camera, she says, well, I'm pleading to a hate crime. He goes, see, she pleads to a hate crime. Yeah, and 2 years from now, he's going to allow her to go ahead and plead that down to something even less, a freaking misdemeanor. She attacks a child, and Alvin Bragg saying that's only a misdemeanor. And Alvin Bragg, of course, has tried to hide behind his own melanin, or rather behind the melanin of the teenage victim of Ponsetto's violent racist attack. Bragg, sounding just like Barack Obama and that buck-dancing police chief in Sanderson after Trayvon Martin was murdered. Bragg said, "As a black man, I have personally experienced racial profiling countless times in my life, and I sympathize with the young man victimized in this incident." Gee, he sounds like every white DA, white politician who hears about a black person being harmed simply for being black, and they give some mamby-pamby, completely vague, insincere fluff and rhetoric and hot air about, I sympathize. This sounds true. I certainly sympathize. And then to top it off, Bragg said, "This plea ensures appropriate accountability for Miss Ponsetto." Gee, now where have we heard that before? Kristen Clark, when she was in court lying to a judge to defy the wishes of the family of Ahmaud Arbery and saying, well, doing something other than what the Ahmaud Arbery family wants, that's going to be the way to give them peace. We're going to do the very thing that they say is going to be an insult to the family and put them in turmoil. We're going to say this is the best thing for them. Now that fat bastard Alvin Bragg, he knows that Ponsetto's already on probation in California for the crimes that she's committed there, and she's just got a string of crimes in California. September 2020, just 3 months before she committed her hate crime in New York, Ponsetto had been given a plea deal for 3 years of summary probation in California after she pleaded no contest for driving under the influence. But just 5 days after that plea deal was given, she got another DUI, and she was caught driving with a suspended license. And that was her third such incident in 2020 alone. You didn't even need to wait for her to attack that young man in New York before you could throw the book at her. She has as clear-cut a case of violation of her probation as you could imagine. She does the very thing that got her put on probation in the first place. And this time she did it with a suspended license. So what happened to her after she violated her probation? Nothing. In fact, a judge in California dropped the public intoxication counts against her on one of her crimes. So this woman's just allowed to go ahead and break the law over and over again, and nothing's done about it. Even with her having made nationwide headlines, neither prosecutors in California nor the first black DA of Manhattan feel that Miya Ponsetto has violated her probation, even though that's exactly what she's been doing. And you didn't even need to wait for her to commit her hate crime to get her on that one. You know the Manhattan DA and the white prosecutors back in California have seen Ponsetto's arrogant interviews, her total disregard for anyone calling out her criminality. This woman is strident and belligerent about her disdain for the law. And yet these prosecutors in 2 different states don't seem to mind. Hell, every time she gets in trouble, they just let her off the hook, the judges, the DAs. But you know, the problem happens to be it's not because she's so special. Nothing makes her special at all. This is standard operating procedure under white supremacy. There is a strict hands-off policy for those of a certain complexion. And don't think for a second that Alvin Bragg, having been part of the U.S. Attorney's Office, has nothing to do with this. Just like Kristen Clark in the Injustice Department, it's obvious across the board, whether it be at the federal level or at the local level, that there is an unspoken rule that where black people are concerned, nothing should ever qualify as a hate crime against us. Black people are harmed, well, that's not a hate crime. It will never be a hate crime. And even if you force them to put a hate crime on someone, well, they're going to go ahead and offer them a plea deal that lets them out of it. I, for one, can't think of any time when someone has pleaded to a felony and then been allowed to come back later and replead to a lesser charge and a misdemeanor no less later on. How the hell does that work? But that was the entire point of all this. When the accused is black, it doesn't matter if it's jaywalking, the authorities will always say it's a felony of some sort, some part of it's a felony. But for other people, doesn't matter if it's a triple homicide or a blatant hate crime, the authorities will always give them a plea deal to a misdemeanor. They don't need an attorney to try to knock down the charges for them. You got the DAs and the judges tripping over their own shoelaces to do it for them. This is the court making it clear. This has nothing to do with your defense attorney. This has everything to do with what color your skin is, and that determines whether or not you're going to be hit with a felony or a misdemeanor. That is the greatest single determinant of what's going to happen to you in court. This was all done, orchestrated, and engineered by Alvin Bragg to make sure that a hate criminal would get no prison time. Now, this attack was a slam dunk and easy case as there ever was. This is an instance where the right thing to do was also the easy thing to do. prosecute this career criminal for all the crimes that she's committed. If anyone fits the profile of the racist, entitled piece of trash, it's her. So why is it that Bragg's bending over backwards to avoid punishing her? You'll recall that after Bragg got elected, I was throwing cold water on all the people who were desperately hoping that he would live up to his largely overblown promises to reopen the investigation into the murder of Eric Garner. Daniel Pantaleo being held accountable, I told people I think that that's going to be a real long shot if you're expecting this Alvin Bragg character to be doing it. I told you that as Manhattan's first black DA, he had to give assurances to the white moneyed interests that put him in office that he wouldn't be deciding that the law now has to apply to them. White immunity from law must continue. And that's what Alvin Bragg is doing. And this is standard operating procedure when you've got these token black firsts in political office. Barack Obama's a great, or rather lousy, example of that. It's important to remember that when Barack Obama was running for office in 2008, he got more money in campaign donations, especially from white-moneyed interests, than W had gotten. Now, how the world do you have a failed congressional candidate who just barely manages to stumble his way into the U.S. Senate? How does a guy like that manage to get more campaign cash from these rich white-moneyed interests than W got? I mean, you think about all the tax breaks and tax cuts and such that W gave to the rich. What on earth could Barack Obama have possibly promised these rich white interests that was more important to them than what W had already done? Well, you have to remember, this country was on the verge of a revolution in 2008. That's what it was. And Barack Obama was meant to be a smokescreen, remind people of America's cardinal sin, its biggest sin, truth be told, its only sin, and pretend as if the country is somehow atoning for it. And in the meanwhile, you got this pliable black bootlick tool, and he's going to make sure that none of these banking criminals goes to prison. That was Barack Obama's job. His job was to take the steam out of the revolution that was building in the streets, and to make sure that all those Wall Street crooks never wound up in prison. And so we see with Alvin Bragg that history is repeating itself. Bring in your token first black DA of Manhattan, he's going to make sure that all of these criminals don't go to jail, and neither do their friends and relations. No doubt that rotund moron Bragg, he's dreaming of whatever higher office that he thinks his white paymasters are going to elevate him to if he plays ball, and he understands that offering black people up to continue to be attacked, and he'll be making excuses for that day in and day out and pleading down the cases and claiming, as a black man, I want you to know I know what you're going through. He's going to be doing that, offering lip service, while he allows the black citizens of New York to be attacked with impunity. And Alvin Bragg is not alone. All of your white Democratic prosecutors and authorities out in California, they know about this Ponsetto woman's violent past, her criminal past. This woman has literally been committing crimes coast to coast. And neither New York nor California seems terribly bothered. Alvin Bragg is a Democrat. And this scumbag's going to be telling black people they ought to vote for him when he runs for re-election. Yeah, because of how much safer black people in New York are because of him. Why, all of those hate criminals, they'll think twice about attacking a black person. I mean, you might get a misdemeanor. The law in America is color conscious, and that's by design, and that's the reason why it has no legitimacy. And Alvin Bragg has reinforced that he's going to continue the same anti-black racist practices that were in place under the odious Cy Vance. Whether or not you get charged with a crime, and whether or not that crime is a felony or a misdemeanor, and whether or not the DA decides to actually try to take the case to trial, it's going to depend entirely on the color of your skin. And don't be surprised when Alvin Bragg calls himself running for re-election, assuming that Stacey Abrams fails yet again to get herself some sort of political office. Don't be surprised when she waddles her way into Manhattan saying, "Vote for Alvin Bragg because of all the good he's done for black people." Oh yeah, the black citizens of New York City, you can rest easy now. Alvin Bragg is busy making the streets safe for hate criminals and racist assaults against black children. And he'll use whatever twisted legal maneuvering that he can to make sure that certain people are insulated from punishment. You see, Jussie Smollett allegedly reported a non-existent crime. Nobody got hurt, nobody got arrested, nobody was even inconvenienced. God knows the crooks in the Chicago PD, they can't claim that they were working. It'd be the first time in the department's history where that occurred. And yet the world had to stop spinning on its axis. Apparently everybody, all human affairs had to come to a stop because a largely Z-list nobody actor had been accused of filing a false police report. Meanwhile, in New York, you have a hate crime caught on video, and we don't see anyone saying there has to be a special prosecutor appointed. The DA clearly is overcome by a bias. We gotta make sure that this piece of trash goes to prison for this. Why is she being allowed to just commit DUI after DUI, crime after crime after crime, and nobody does anything about it? Oh no, there's no outcry on this one. It's not supposed to be. This needs to be buried. So all the white supremacist thugs in the NYPD and every anti-black racist citizen in the city knows that black people are open targets because the DA is on the side of the hate criminals. He's going to make sure that hate crimes are not a felony, not on his watch. But that's not to say that Alvin Bragg isn't going to be going after hate crimes at all, quite the opposite. Because at the same time that the news was breaking that he was going to be letting the hate criminal Miya Ponsetto off the hook, Alvin Bragg was also announcing that he was going to be bolstering and increasing the Manhattan DA's hate crimes unit. That he is now seeking an additional $1.6 million from the city of New York to hire new staffers and to expand the DA's hate crimes team. And why is he doing this? Well, because of the attacks on Asians in New York, not the attacks on black people. You know, black children being attacked and being beaten by a bunch of white supremacist thugs and caught on video. Well, that doesn't really move Alvin Bragg. If it's happening to black people, well, there's no need to worry about that. But everybody else, though, they need to be protected. The bad guys know that they have a friend in Alvin Bragg. Black people in New York, they better understand they've got an enemy in him. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Robert Fletcher, David Green, Tavin Boone, Jesse Garrett, and Sakina Collins. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.